Hello everyone, today we talk about the twilight of Byzantine culture of Constantinople, the 15th century, and as you understand, aside from some of the so-called successor states in a sense, just the first half of it, at least until May the 29th, 1453, the date on which Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. This is not really much of an introduction to the time in itself, right, or specifically of Byzantine history, but if you want a perspective on, yes, surely the empire and its neighbors and the surrounding regions, mostly, Western Anatolia and the Balkans, in a, in fact, in a broader interpretation of what this concretely was like. I made already two videos explaining here and there, for example, the concept of Byzantine, why I use it, even though I perfectly recognize all the Romanity that the empire had at that point and how it's a matter of historiographical convention. But of course, there is also some kind of, content to it when it comes to significance to it, when it comes to properly certain cultural characteristics that the empire had acquired over the centuries that also we will not discuss today but have to be borne in mind, because in those videos, and some of which were controversial, especially the one on the term of Byzantine, a symbological trap, was some recrimination, because I said objectively very harsh things, not much about the empire itself, but in a sense, in the way, as always, it is interpreted today, and not really for the better, meaning that the empire surely has acquired a special significance of resilience, of Christian civilization, of contrast again, resistance against the Islamic invasions and all these things. But naturally, Byzantine history is first of all much more than that. And in a way, it's also something very, overlapping and intersected with so many other realities and dimensions that it's difficult not to see, let's say, something less ideological in it and something more concrete. Right? This was every power is unique in its own kind, and surely the Byzantine Empire was more in a way, given its importance, given its meaning, its symbolism, etc. But at the same time, when we study history, we study it for what things are, from a real historical point of view. That is, without having sympathies or antipathies towards this or that power, and trying to be as concrete as possible, especially in explaining certain dynamics that are somewhat forgotten, especially when we talk about southeastern Europe and the rise of the Ottomans in the first place, how this was possible, right? And there is a bit of teleological determinism in this, in from looking at the intentions properly of the single powers, or saying, there is much blaming. So I remember once there was a legitimate complaint, for example. There are still bitter feelings regarding, for example, the Western attitude towards the empire, the Ottoman advance. These things are very still felt, understandably, in the Balkans. I made multiple videos explaining how, why this was the case, because I believe that history is, first of all, understanding, trying to give an answer of why and how things happened, and most of the times, independently from the point of view or the side, if there is any such thing, as of course we are all biased in a way, let's say there is always kind of middle ground one can reflect and to observe that naturally lots of things in history go in ways that are, first of all, unpredictable, and secondly, not quite dichotomically explainable, right? In fact, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks is hardly anything dichotomic in nature, right? It is true that essentially the Westerners, up to the very last decades, could have actually overturned the situation, as it's also known, I mean, obviously from a military historical point of view, that even the 1453 siege of Constantinople was not to end necessarily with the fall of the city, uh, nor that the Ottoman advance could have not been essentially repelled later on or crushed. There were many moments in which the same Ottomans had severe problems, and you can't study history or politics of warfare without acknowledging that this is basically happening all the time with any power. So one should rather understand why, for example, the Ottoman Empire was so successful on the long run, right? Conquering Constantinople was, in that sense, teleological for the Turks, because that was indeed for the same Muslims a symbol of universalism, right? And of universal power, of ecumenic ambitions. The Ottomans very serenely acquired the title of Roman emperors after the conquest of Constantinople, and independently from whether we want to accept that or not, that's what factually happened. And not just that, they ruled over the land of the Romans for centuries, right? And this doesn't happen if there isn't something that bases that, and that's surely not just terror because you can't fundamentally control. Not even with the coercive means of the 21st century, a hostile population at large, right? And the truth, even around the Constantinopolitan siege of 1453, is that, of course, gates were opened from the within, that there was a wall, if you want, positive intent to let the Turks at that specific point take the city for a need of broader pacification. And the Ottoman Empire, as you know, went on with a great deal of Orthodox or of Jewish, etc., participation. And it was an extremely diverse country where dynamics were obviously concentrated, by the way, in the most productive areas, as fundamentally the ones of the former empire remained. Constantinople was a great city once again under the Ottomans, which had hardly been after 1204, when the Crusaders had effectively looted everything valuable that had been. So there is a lot of things that sometimes people do not want to hear because they're somewhat painful. They don't fit in the prearranged mythology that in the West, I presume, we have built around Constantinople, meaning that even the universality, of course, here it's the Romanity that really matters in a way, but even that, as you know, it was debatable at the time. Not in legalistic terms, because objectively, yes, that was Romantic, but that the exclusivity of Romanity was debatable. I believe, personally, if you look at those videos I made on the Renovatio Imperii, that of course there is a deeper sense of the Imperium that at that point becomes Roman or something else, but still what fundamentally matters is the Imperium itself and the actual faculty of command. That in this sense, in Byzantine history, even if you see it in perspective of the Ottoman conquest, it's tragically reasserted even in the moment of greatest crisis as the ideological glue that kept things together. This is a bit what I would like to stress today. That is to say how things at the end had gone toward a direction that was evidently showing another world, another era essentially emerging, if you want. It's also a bit of an ideological era idea within itself, but that has some deeper meaning. And authority is central, as we know, to medieval civilization. That is a moment in history where, of course, like in all pre-industrial society, and in this the empire was no different from any other, had a great deal of difficulty to ensure it, right? How to measure and define authority in itself, right? The Byzantines had it easy from, in fact, a legalistic point of view. They already had all a legacy to live on and to, treasure and to boast. That surely was their own prerogative, right? But there is also a broader idea of such that I think in the West we have forgotten, and that we have resumed only for the culture Byzantine Empire altogether, not all the other powers of the time, West included, but also the Muslims or any other power out there, that is the deeper understanding of what in fact the empire was at the time. That is a capacity to tame the forces of nature and of anarchy in a universal and theological sense, right? So placing themselves in the humble relation to the stability of God, as an example. These are all civilizational tools that are frankly also valid today, and not really, there's not really a culture to sustain them anymore for reasons that we discuss here and there. But it was completely normal at the time. That is, before the French Revolution especially. There was hardly anything that would kind of distract, even if you look at the American one, there wasn't really a denial of this pre-existing idea. Well, when the state became the source of law, like in civil law, this was surely functional and still functional today to a big deal of things that are positive, in spite of also the negative ones that always exist in any community. But the world was literally conceived as this, of what the Byzantines would have called their own way in Greek, taxes, right? The taxes is properly the order. It's a term that, you find also military history about the formations, order, all these things. And it had to reflect this broader, especially in the deeply Hellenized mentality of the Roman Empire at that point, properly in fact, a metaphysical order of fact. It's a theoretical and ideological, the same immanent reality had to be replicated through, of course, the imperial rule on Earth. So it's no surprise that by the 15th century, the Byzantines would crave for taxes rather than in any other time of their history, because of course they were realizing that taxes that in theory should have ruled the world entire, and that once the Roman Empire had factually achieved, because it's not even a matter of knowing, having a contemporary geographical notions, is properly realizing what was the world at the time. Yes, the Roman Empire ruled over the entirety of the world, and there is no doubt about this of any sort. And the Byzantines were deeply convinced of the same, of the enrichment even that the new Rome had brought in this regard, right? As contrary, yes, they believed to be Romans in a way, but their view was mostly, if you want, a Constantinian one. In many ways. So the shift definitely had happened in some ways, and there was some kind of national, proto-national, let's say, consciousness even arising in what was called the Hellenic as a pagan in the previous centuries, was coming back at some level. So still in a classicistic sense, right? Very much as a elitistic imitation of classical literature, but still was changing slightly, also because the evidence is that all the taxes at that point was just Constantinople, basically in a few kilometers around the city. So, you could even spot a cognitive dissonance about what was going on, and of course the fact that this was pointed out, as we will see now, by other powers. I said, for example, Grand Prince Vasily I of Moscow, 1389-1425, complained that while there was an Orthodox church, a church, because, by the way, that was the only one possible. It's as if the Catholics, of course, had not existed in that taxes, nor any other options, let's say. There didn't seem to be a credible emperor in Constantinople, which is like, whoa. At that point, of course, Muscovy was already more powerful than factually what Constantinople was in political and military terms. Of course, they share different areas of influence in different regions, but the Russians, as you know, were the best accomplishment of Orthodox evangelization. Historically, they had this deep, properly Byzantine, properly look at their names, look at still today. Russia definitely leaves on that legacy. At that point, by the way, Moscow was properly gathering this universal ambition in itself, because Kiev, the archdiocese of Kiev had been shifted to Vladimir after the Mongol invasions. Then essentially the Muscovites seized it again. So there was this idea of all Russias and all that's the Tsardom, as a matter of fact. So essentially the equivalent, the imperial equivalent. That also the Bulgarians, for example, back in the day had shared. Also the Latins, in a way, had in the West emulated their own way. The Holy Roman Empire, etc. So this is definitely not really so as Patriarch Antonius the Fourth of Constantinople, 1393, properly realized that this taxes was approaching also to the end of the world. Still, the confidence was to realize that order still existed in a way. In fact, that's also the prevalent view at that point. If Constantinople was to fall, the world had to end. Right? The saying goes for Rome. People say, the day Rome will crumble, the world will crumble. Right? And which has a much deeper meaning that most Westerners at this point are culturally able, not even willing, to understand, which is sounds dramatically close exactly to what that crumbling actually should be like, probably the values that lay under Western civilization as such. So the taxes was of course at this point. So first of all, how they counted years. Basically, the world was created according to the Bible on September, at least to the Byzantine view of it, on September the 1st, 5508 BC. And Gennadius II Scholarius, that would be essentially the first patriarch after the fall of Constantinople under Sultan Mehmed II, had to put matter in cosmic proportion, right? And he had foretold doomsday on September the 1st, 1492, which is nice, considering also the coincidence with between two events. I mean, normally we still think the Middle Ages ended in either 1453 or 1492. 1492 being the discoveries of the Americas, the death of Lawrence the Magnificent. It's objectively it's still for us a symbolical date. For them, they had calculated that would have been the end of the world, and who knows that it wasn't, right? in this perspective, at least the beginning of the end of the world. So the truth, naturally, aside from this, in fact, internal taxes perspective, let's say, is that in 1393, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, who had essentially won his throne after the vassalage of Serbia in 1389, after the bloodbath of Kosovo-Napoleon, properly actually the death of the Sultan at the time, had annexed also Bulgaria, was preparing to encircle the government and residence of Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, 1391-4025 in New Rome, right? And this blockade seemingly would have brought to the fall of Constantinople at that point, at the beginning of the 15th century. But as you know, there was a major event coming from the east, breaking these plans. That was essentially the Timurid victory and the Ottoman Sultan kidnapping after the Battle of Ankara, right, in 1402. This marks an important watershed because essentially the Tartars, the Mongols had crushed the Ottomans, who in this sense suffered a deep blow, probably also from later on a political strife, etc. That's where actually the Westerners could have easily intervened, and instead backed the future ruler Mehmed I, right? And when the Ottoman conquest was brought again. It would have been tremendously easy. The same crusaders supported and the Hospitallers brought to this Ottoman recompaction. That telling you in a Clausewitzian perspective how all power is radically fluid, and you can't quite predict much, and that there was nothing, again, deterministic about the fall of Constantinople, not even at that point, realistically, right, easily, and positively measurable. Because the Mongols, yes, had left Anatolia. That was fundamentally their westernmost, point of, of their invasion. And that also the Timurid power they were always unstable on their own. They didn't have a fixed territorial permanent base. That would always be these movements of peoples from Central Asia investing Persia and so that's a bit the history of the Middle East in a nutshell. And however, the crisis had shown the weakness of the Ottoman Sultanate. That was, if you want, a young power, right? Or at least, in terms of properly as a concrete one. It had already achieved a lot, but was yet to become the great empire that stretched literally from Sudan to the Ukraine to Hungary to the Persian Gulf. So the Ottomans regrouped, and by 1453, what we see is definitely a desolating spectacle, right? And the broader interpretation here is not really Constantinople besieged now as a bulwark of Western identity. Not the same Westerners that at that point wouldn't give a damn. Right, or at least they would after the city fell, because they realized now they would have been next, especially certain powers, still the others were still kind of playing in that way. And if you look at in a broader perspective, yeah, I mean, the Ottomans never had an historical chance to arrive to the river Thames, right? Not even if they had conquered Vienna at the beginning of the 16th century or at the end of the 17th, right? There is a limit, right? The Ottoman Empire is already a miracle by itself, meaning they had constantly three open fronts, and they managed to exist for hundreds of years with their own resources, and that's also something that should be properly acknowledged. But especially at this point, the reality, already before the fall of Constantinople, what was Constantinople at that point? The Ottomans de facto already ruled what Constantinople had ruled, and this is the reality of the story. That the Ottoman sultans were already the rulers of Orthodox Christians, as Constantinople had already lost a grip on them, right? And again, any foreign invasion is, especially in this time, is accompanied by all the most horrifying things you can imagine, with oppression, etc. But as we were saying before, no, Orthodox Christians didn't live in the Ottoman Empire as slaves or, constantly. No, the Ottomans needed them, because the Greeks, also other communities such as the Jews, or other, let's say, the elites, especially of the provincial territories, etc., were all co-opted in the Ottoman government. Right? Always remember this: that there is hardly, even properly in the origin of the Sultan, the Turks were not really a people as we imagine it, right? That's another thing that it's difficult, because you see, it's as if Turkish nationalism feeds itself of the bullshit, of course, of the Turkic origin. The Christian nationalism, because there is such a thing, or Western nationalism, if you prefer, feeds itself with the idea that, of course, that these Turks were something completely different. The truth being is that the Ottomans at this point were the same Byzantines. I mean, the Ottomans had properly born as a power, literally, in the face of Constantinople, in areas that were deeply and radically, first Hellenized and secondly Romanized for millennia. Right, no doubt that were a lot of these scumbags coming from all over the at that point Eurasia, as raiders, pillagers, looters, etc., that greatly increased the size of Ottoman armies. But when you factually look at also what was already, I don't know, the Byzantine Empire, every time they settle all these avalanches of peoples from the Eurasian steppes and constantly settling them over and over and over and over and over again, all over the Balkans or in Anatolia, or deporting other subjects, you don't see actually much of a difference of what concretely the thing was. You know that Byzantine civilization was fundamentally just the cities at this point, right? The cities and the coastal areas, like the trade connection of the maritime areas, the interlands, even in places as close as, in fact, what we call Rumelia, broadly speaking, also across Bulgaria, Thrace, Albania, Morea, etc., Serbia, were fundamentally something else. Okay, Serbia maybe it's not Rumelia, strictly speaking, but was still born within the empire historically as a power. So, and this is the proof of what I'm saying, meaning that literally who inhabited those places really wouldn't feel really more of a Roman than the circumstances would allow him to feel loyal to, right? And that's also the reality of not of just of the Byzantine Empire. This really happened everywhere, right? It's just that the Balkans had a very specific history connected to the Byzantine rule and these constant waves of peoples and incapacity at some point of the empire to control the rise of other centers. It's like think about the Bulgarians. We made a video recently about the first Bulgarian Empire, right? Yes, it was crushed, but the Bulgarians were still there, and they hardly liked to think they were ruled or by the Romans. Like with the Ottomans, things changed, meaning that of course all these peoples retained an identity and autonomy, right? But at least this power lasted for other hundreds of years after times, especially after the Fourth Crusade, in which the whole Balkans saw in fact the resurgence of those same powers because there was no effective power anymore to control them. And remember this: the Ottomans were a dynasty, right? They were not a people. So of course, what we see as Ottoman armies, they were Anatolians, Bulgarians, Serbians, Greeks, Turks meant culturally, in what, of course, the Ottoman dynasty aggrandized itself with any possible form of ecumenic overlordship symbolism, including the Roman one, as we've seen, the Mongol one, the Turkic one, everything. Right? They even started imitating papal tiaras, famously enough, and the Westerners also liked, as we know, to really make each other quite expensive Turkish gifts to one another. And this is the story of properly of Western Europe narrowly meant, like modern Europe narrowly meant. I mean, we were created in a sense as this specific identity differently from the Middle Ages because we had to face a power like the Ottoman one. Because the concept of modern Europe or Western Central Europe do not have the same sense objectively if the Ottoman Empire had not existed. And the same way for the Ottomans. That is, this power was owed more to the West more than we can imagine. Factually, they were Westerners, and needless to say, Constantinople is still Turkish, and cities do not change place either. So that's in Europe, right? So yes, we share. I stand on the soil of a continent where that's still the reality, and Turkey is in NATO. Yes, then it's a bit slippery in a sense, but at the end of the day, we have built our world with a dramatic closeness of the Ottoman Empire to the West, rather than it was to Persia, or to even certain decentralized areas like Egypt, etc. It was already more Westernized, of course, than we think. So this is yet another realization. The Ottomans, by the time Constantinople was falling, were already controlling an overwhelming greater amount of Orthodox Christians than the Byzantine Emperor did, right? So there was also a contempt naturally towards the Byzantine, towards the Turks, but from the Byzantine side. In fact, Patriarch Antonius used the term nation, like ethnos in Greek, or Latin natio, which was a pejoratively term to describe barbarians altogether. It's like the Gentiles. It's really the idea that if there is something outside the Ecumenic Empire, this is an anomaly, right? Unfortunately, at that point, the empire was just a city, and so basically all the rest of the world was an anomaly. And this couldn't but be seen in an eschatological perspective. If that was the state, the order of things, the taxes, well, it's because the world was coming to an end, right? And the same reason why Patriarch Antonius wouldn't call himself a Greek or a Hellene, of course, was an insult, as we were saying before, in spite of some, reserve, kind of national sensitivity resurgence, because the term meant nothing short but a pagan, if anything, right? It was not a matter of saying itself was not really, Greek, or they were writing Greek, right? So that's not the point. The point was that there was nothing else but the Romans. There can't be anything else but the Romans. That's the Ecumenic Empire. What is the rest? There is no other way to call themselves, right? And you understand that there is something that doesn't work in this. Like, I hate just to stress it, but we have to be concrete. Like, this is not much different from the controversies of saying, today I feel like, identify like a pansexual kangaroo. Like, there is something there that you have to admit about a reality that that has to make sense in a logical, rational form, and that you have to at least explain to be properly, point out. It was normal for them, but also it was just evident to everybody, to themselves as well, what is it. But the show had to go on till the end. And in fact, the Saint Patriarch Antonius wrote in Greek of himself, quote, as Patriarch of Constantinople, our moderation, Antonius, elect of God, Archbishop of Constantinople, the New Rome. By the way, this other thing of the New Rome is it's as if they had literally themselves taken the place of another humanity. You understand? An ecumenical patriarch, right? So today we call these guys Byzantines, right? And I understand it's not particularly nice. Like it's like I made the example before, but it's properly the idea properly. How do you don't want to be called, right? And why should I call you like that? You see how contemporary this problem is, right? At some point, this is evident, especially in moments of crisis, in moments of denial, in moments of rejection, and this is exactly what the Byzantines felt themselves about. They needed to stress the fact that their order couldn't be broken because they wouldn't accept that it could, right? It's wrong to call them Byzantines because this wouldn't be better to call the French the Lutetians, right? But that's also, like, at that point you should question most of your language. Like, if you're French and you call the Germans les Allemands, the question is, are you going to change that because the Germans call themselves the Deutschen? Like, nobody cares. Legitimately, it's not a big deal. So it shouldn't be even to call this the Byzantines to trying to make up for the mess that history was in the first place, not how they felt to call themselves like. Naturally, there was also a problem is that in the real Rome, there was somebody who had fundamentally broken with the Orthodox Church, and it was ruling as, on a reality. It was at that point also about to enter, its own crisis with the reform and everything, but that was still also gone much far ahead than what the Byzantines were at that point, not just in territorial terms, but literally, properly, the same Westerners had crushed them back in the day. That world mess was, as we've seen just now, in a sense, direct or indirect fault of the Westerners. And as you know, the Westerner help in Constantinople was quite meager. There were essentially just a bunch of Italians and other nationalities. Because they were particularly interested in Greece, because they had holdings there since centuries. So they intervened, but their governments said, okay, well, they were aware of the threat, right? But legitimately, the situation, as I was saying before, could have evolved in very different ways. Independently, and still it was normal for 15th century standards to have that kind of reaction. Also considering that the Westerners had actually sent some of the greatest expeditions in medieval history, the ones of Nicopolis and the one of Narva, that by themselves also, independently from the outcome, were a major help, right? Help read, let's hope to crush the Ottomans and take over again the whole Byzantine Empire at that point and the surroundings. But it was surely a help, right? And not quite differently from what the Crusades theoretically had been, right? There was surely an interest of the West to keep the Turks out, in a way. So of course the Byzantines still called themselves Romans, Romaioi in Greek, right? Which was synonymous of Christian, by the way. There is an anecdote from a northeastern Turk who explained that, quote, speaking of the land, this was Roman country. They spoke Christian here. So properly stressing, of course, the ignorance and disorientation, but the fact that being Roman and Christian in the Byzantine society community was the same thing. Like, it didn't matter. Well, you could equivocate even in at that point of what they spoke, right? There was nor Roman nor Christian, but Greek. And of course, Christian is not a language, but properly, that was so imbued as a radical core, hybrid identity that there was no way to properly, that even in those countries that eventually were taken over by other people, that the idea of Rome and of its mystics and its symbolism had remained so strong and also naturally attached to the Christian reality, so much that actually the Sultanate of Rome was, the westernmost of the Seljuk offsprings, I'll call it in this way, was the Sultanate of Rome. That is proper, and Rumelia, also in the Ottoman Empire, took the name for the land of the Romans, Romania, and that was unavoidable because, of course, the Seljuks also were like the Vikings, were like anybody, maybe except the Westerners, were trying to make their own Roman Empire. Surely, an overwhelming symbol of power and prosperity at the time, of course, and couldn't but be, in fact, there was an idiot, I don't remember, it was when I still shared Schwerpunkt videos on Facebook groups, that was one of those, complete nuts that shave their head the alleged Viking hairstyle, because they feel they think they are Viking people reincarnated, right? And this guy had to complain the fact that I would use the Sultanate of Rome as a title because since the term Rome is Arabic and not Western, so that's kind. According to the guy who was naturally an ethno-nationalist, this would have been a sort of bowing, historiographical bowing to tolerance to Islamic fundamentalism and all this bullshit. And I found it, aside from the idiot in question, but properly, instead actually a deep and enormous and extremely significant thing to remember, that a Muslim, a barely Muslim, because there were even pagans at the time, they were another, like the Seljuks, would be so overwhelmed by the might of the Roman Empire to essentially say that the lands where they settled was not like Turkey land or whatever, but was freaking Rome, right? So, but I guess it's too much to ask for certain forms of, let's call it intelligence. Let's give the benefit of the doubt. So you understand indeed, this is a radical universal cultural impact that the Byzantine Empire had left there. And it's difficult for us at this point in history to understand how far-reaching this this thing was, right? And it doesn't belong objectively to what has become the West, right, historically, right? Because already at the time, the West thought something else of itself. Like, let's be honest, it had gone past that and was somewhat not even interested in that. Not just because the Byzantine Empire had declined, but factually because they had their own view at that point. It was already properly not even caring that much about the Holy Roman Empire in itself, nor about the papacy, nor about the emperor. And factually, certain countries were taking off, especially towards modernity as central states by those time standards, and as you know, going on for conquering at that point literally the world war. Like if you look at the British, the French, etc. So, well, okay, England was a bit far from that. Like it would take another 200 years to be a main power, but still, you see a country like France at that point, even compared to Germany, what was supposedly to be the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, like as a state worth of this name, right? By the time Constantinople fell, right, which is not also, it's another random, it's the end of the 100 Years' War, right, and the French victory. So I like to be harsh in these terms because I think there's no way to mix cards here. There's no way to make relativism about it. It's good to be honest, to respect those identities, but also to tell them for what they were, right? And in fact, this was when you speak the language of civilization, right? You know that you have to come to some compromises, and that's when the emperors did. You see, a patriarch would not done it. A Byzantine emperor would, as John VIII Palaiologos, 1425-1448, did, by appealing to an older Rome and another Catholic, meaning properly universal. You know that, before the schism in the 11th century, the name of the church is Catholic, right? It has nothing to do with the sense of modern confession of Catholicism, right, etc. We're talking properly about the fact that it's kataolon in Greek. It means through the entire. It's properly the entirety of the universe, right? So, of course, the popes in Rome had built their own Catholic church, to which all the West responded, and so, of course, those who have to rule for real know that they had to come to some compromise, and that naturally was a matter of a church reunification, right? Naturally, John VIII Palaiologos, as a true born in the purple Roman emperor, etc., would have found strange to be described, for example, in Latin when he came to Italy at the Council of. First it was Ferrara, but it would be passed on to history as the one of Florence, because it was plagued there. They had to transfer there. And on July the 6th, 1439, he would actually sign himself in Christ God faithful Emperor and Autocrat of the Romans in Greek, right, in Greek alphabet, and not just in language, right. And while in Latin, the Westerners had defined him in Emperor of the Greeks. What was this council about? Well, I think we should all know. Factually, in the Council of Florence 1439, the Western and the Eastern churches were reunited in one. More specifically, essentially the Constantinopolitan Church became a Roman Catholic one, right? This is what was established in the West at that point, because the Turks were at gates and was not much else that Constantinople could do without Western help. The popes were the only ones that could indict a crusade and to organize, to have the means, the connections, the wealth to organize another one. But as you know, the thing would bring to nothing. Like the Westerners, for what it was worth to them, had, especially the papacy, said, okay, finally the Greeks have bowed to us. The Byzantines in Constantinople completely ignored or slash rejected, but ignoring, I think, is a better, like, proper, because it was a willing ignorance of the council of establishment of the council of Florence, because of course it was impossible. The emperor had gone to, to Italy to say to the West that that churches were united. Like, what? Like, what does it even mean? Who are these people? Right? Why did they go there? It was properly not understood, and that's there couldn't be any other reaction to that. So of course it changed nothing, but some maybe opening, of course, of the West towards, the help to the Byzantines, etc., and so on. So for us, it may seem like not such an important thing, but at the time it was, right? For a Byzantine emperor to be humiliated at the point of having to renounce to its core identity, as we've seen, as a Roman, as an Orthodox Christian, etc., was of capital importance. The whole legacy of the multimillenary empire of Constantinople. Roughly with the 9th century, the Muslim era was what the Ottomans first named the Byzantines for what they were. It was subjects of a church we had survived an empire, the called Rome or Roman, right? And the definition holds to this very day, right? And in fact, the example of the villager that said, they spoke Christian because it was a Roman country here, tells it all. So recently I've been made, that we make essentially our series about Byzantine history, so we talk abundantly, at least for our space, allowing about this whole deal and what the broader historiographical perspectives of the Byzantine Empire are, etc. And there was in Constantinople also, as we've seen, essentially the concentration of an entire identity. Part of the reason why the Ottomans ruled now the surroundings of Constantinople in Asia and Europe was because of the centralization of the same empire, in a way, meaning that Constantinople was the only ruler of the Byzantine Empire. There wasn't actually a real autonomy, if not, in proportion to the decrease of central power for the other lands, right? What really made the difference in Constantinople, also identitarily speaking, was properly the church, like the Roman Orthodox one, and this capacity, this spiritual centrality that even exceeded the empire's boundaries, whichever they should have been practically, because as we've seen, ideally they weren't. Like, the world was theirs as long as they existed, such as in Russia, for example, or in other, like in the Balkans, etc. And we don't know, unfortunately, much about the agreements between the Ottomans and the Roman Orthodox after the fall of Constantinople. Surely there was another taxes established, or actually an extension of the previous one, right? The Ottomans at that point swallowed anything Byzantine had remained, namely Morea, Pontus. So there was still paradoxically the stigma of Florence 1439 that continued on, because again, even after the fall of Constantinople, the Roman Orthodox Church was engaging in some international recognition. At that point, they had to obey. They were within a power that was essentially enemy with the Roman Catholics as an Islamic power. And as we were saying before, the power of the church remained, right? That of patronage, of homeland, of that sense of, in fact, properly Roman identity that had survived up to this point. And there were as we were saying before, other lands that had somewhat won a greater autonomy during this last times of crisis of the empire. One city was Thessaloniki. It was, as we often said also recently, the only true city after Constantinople in the empire, but also Mistras, also Trebizond, right? There were other entities, think about Epirus, same time. These had been historically, you know, at this point, since 2 centuries, essentially detached really from the center. At least Thessaloniki was mostly connected, but the other lands were explaining that about Palaiologan aristocracy the other week or day, when explaining how the Palaiologan reconquest of Constantinople in the 13th century had even been possible in terms of local autonomies and facilitations and dynastic ties. There was the very invading Italian influence. There were the Hospitaliers. There were some local, probably in fact Latin or Frankish powers, right? Especially along the Adriatic coast. These were mainly Italian. This in the Aegean, until 1523, also in the Dodecanese, right? Until 1571 in Cyprus as well, as the Venetians had taken over from the Genoese, the Lusignan holdings. Albania was conquered by the Ottomans from 1397 to 1497. Bulgaria in 1393. Serbia between 1389 and 1459. Herzegovina and southern Bosnia between 1463 and 1465. Right? So, north of the Danube, that was fundamentally where the Byzantine world had ended historically. So everything south was essentially Romania, but there was some extension of Romanity. Let's say that if you want, you also think about the Romance speakers in Romania today, that of course take the name after the Byzantine legacy, because of, for example, think about Wallachia, we talked about recently. That would be, however, a tributary of the Ottoman Empire itself between from 1462 to 1476, become such. Moldavia from 1455 to 1512, right? These, in fact, were Orthodox countries. There were also Crimean communities that Mehmed II made tributary in 1475. The Black Sea was transformed into an Ottoman lake with the fall of Constantinople, well before the broader expansion in the Balkans was properly secured as such. Even in the east, as you know, the Ottomans were fundamentally a northwestern Anatolian power. So the other end was historically something else. We've seen, the Tartar incursion at the beginning of the 15th century, but still there was a Persian influence in the Mesopotamia. There was still the Sultanate, the Mamluk Sultanate, taken over by the Ottomans at the beginning of the 16th century, but that had, was the major power stretching literally from Sudan to Syria. It had a major impact, probably also on Ottoman culture at some point. There were so many other cultures and peoples and communities, churches living within. For example, the Khazars, the Armenians, the Karaite Jews that were ruled by the Krim Tatar Khans in the area. There were the Roman, we're talking about Crimea specifically, Roman Orthodox princes of Gothia, later land of where the relics of the Gothic peoples in the migration era had remained. The Genoese consuls in Kaffa, right? So a very diverse land. So by the end of the 15th century, there were fundamentally only two independent Orthodox powers outside the Ottoman Empire existing in the world, and very far from one another. One was a bit of a forgotten one, that is Ethiopia, that had actually subscribed to the Union of Florence, However, its Solomonic king, it was the Negus Naud, ruling between 1478-1508, had, if you want, his own kind of church, like if you want, his own orthodoxy. So, and it was too far away from, like, there were now the Ottomans would dwell in the middle. These powers would reconnect mostly paradoxically when the Europeans opened the Cape of Good Hope route to reach the Indian Ocean from the Atlantic one, reaching East Africa. And Moscow had fundamentally not recognized what happened in Florence. So, on the contrary, had, in a way, like, it hadn't even been dramatically affected by the fall of Constantinople in itself, right? It was a way to actually claim part of the legacy of Orthodoxy, right? It's like when Moscow was still considered the third Rome, ideally, right? Because of the Tsardom and, the true Orthodox power that survived after, and all the connections with the empire that had pre-existed. Grand Prince Ivan III, 1462-1505, could also boast a blood legacy. He had married the niece of Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Constantinople, 1449-1453, who died sword in hand, defending his own city while the Ottomans were swarming inside. So an heroic destiny, if you want, of a Roman emperor couldn't but die defending the last soil of universal power, of Romanity, of Christianity. But that this thing of imperial blood had been a big deal. The Byzantines they were extremely cautious about the genealogical implications that could arise from foreign marriages. As, for example, they were very, very, very careful never to make a Westerner marry a Byzantine princess. This had happened just maybe with Otto II back in the 10th century, where there was a shady, regime and power in Constantinople. There were secondary, let's say, marriage of second order or third order, if you want, but never quite, And this because, of course, Constantinople knew perfectly well that the Westerners would have seized that opportunity of claiming dynastic descendancy to stress a legitimacy of blood, especially through their feudal view of power. But about the Russian, the Byzantine legacy of Russia, it should be stressed that Russia proper wouldn't have its own patriarchy until 1589, right? Because Constantinople had forfeited the title, could acquire their own, their own place as third Rome. At the end of the 7th millennium, in Constantinople, from their own calculation, Patriarch Maximus IV, 1491-7, wouldn't actually try to foretell a doomsday, right? Which then, when this would come, and and as by that point, most Roman Orthodox had adopted the Western computation of Anno Domini. That tells you also how permeable at that point that society was, and it had already been historically now to Western influence that had taken over at some point, even the empire, and still been poured in so many other elements from the Frankish principalities to the Italian colonies. I mean, it was so. It had already happened in a way, so that's all the more elitistic to compute the world and its perspectives through that older way, right? It's sad, right? It's sad because, yes, it is beautiful as a tradition, but at the same time, that takes the place of a resignation and, or let's say, of a capacity maybe to do something else in the first place, and to intervene more concretely, or that concretely, and this is the truth, the Constantinopolitans preferred by far Islamic rule to Catholic one, right? This is not very different from at least what the Lutherans said about the fact that they preferred Islamic rule over the papal one, but that was a bit of chit chat. I mean, with Constantinople, it factually happened, and if anything, if the city fell the way it did, by the way, and how the whole thing was rearranged afterwards. And you have to understand that too, because nobody likes warfare, really, when it comes to disrupt your own house. So that's understandable. And let's say that it was possible, however, in this perspective, still to have a church without an emperor. Now, this is interesting. The Orthodox Church had never had something like, since ever, like an emperor telling them essentially what to do, because that's what Byzantine society was like. So you can't. It's not even a Constantinian thing. It was set like that, as the Constantinopolitan Church was, like the Senate, was created exactly, to avoid what was like in Rome, right? But in this broader Byzantine perspective, of course, there had never been an emperor a church without an emperor, right? But after 4053, they had to accept that was the case, right? So again, a sultan was better than a doge or a pope to them. And also Patriarch Maximus urged the Venetians to grant rights and freedom of worship to the Roman Orthodox in the Ionian Islands, as they enjoyed in the same way they enjoyed in the Ottoman Empire, right? Because the Ottomans were, for those time standards, quite tolerant, exactly because they knew that there was no other way to control these lands as effectively as they would. While the Roman Orthodox Church in Cyprus had to wait, in fact, until 1571 and the fall of Famagusta for having its own autonomy, because the Venetians, as Catholics, had maintained them instead, the Latin cult, etc. So this is yet another deep divide when you realize that yes, the situation in the Ottoman Empire, as we were saying before, was divided, was segmented, meaning that not all communities enjoyed the same degree of autonomy, of course. Surely the Balkans suffered more, than Constantinople in itself, given the set of privileges in itself. But it's like, I don't know, think about the Devshirme. Right, at the beginning it was a terrorizing barbarian practice where children were literally kidnapped from families that hid in the mountains, etc. Later on, like 1 century afterwards, those same families would hand their own children to the Ottomans, because they knew that if their children would become janissaries, they could reward them with lands. It happened the same way. So you understand that there was indeed a civilization behind the Ottoman Empire, and that this wasn't, that again, that no power can exist historically without the decisive moral support of its own communities, right? There's not even a totalitarianism that worked because there was some evil guy that controlled everybody. This is not physically it's not human. Human communities never work this way. It's impossible. You can't control people. It's a too unpredictable and complex and unmeasurable of a system, right? But you still do need the decisive moral force of these people. So you have to give them something in exchange, right? You have to make them believe something, yes, but these people are going to think that as long as it's apparently convenient to them, and or they maybe haven't had anything better, right? And yes, you can do an enormous damage mentally, but these are not the times and places where this would happen. Like the Soviet Union, in part, kept together not because there was anything good about that in the first place, but because Russia was consistently had such appalling standards by 20th century that whether it was under communism, what it was before, was not necessarily such a sensible difference, right? Given, the millions of people were exterminated in the most stupid and cruel ways, but still these people for the first time had mass literacy, which in Russia was non-existent before. So there is always something in exchange, and it's never like pure tyranny. And surely that comes along with significant psychological damage, meaning that, for example, denial of reality is one still in many countries still, for example, as a Soviet legacy or a communist legacy. It's there. It's by default. It's very well studied psychologically at all levels now. But that is also properly not to accept that there is something outside, which was a big deal for those regimes to prevent other people to know, because if they had known the sheer amount and the appalling amount of moral and material misery that for which they lagged behind compared to the rest of at least the Western world, they would have wondered. I have some family memories about, I mean, not directly, but people, some of my relatives that went on vacations in Soviet Russia, and they told me certain stories that made me understand since a very early age what is reality and what is nonsense, right? And I will never forget them, because turns out not just they were real, but that there is still a lot to work, because this thing has left a damage that will not be erased still in generations. And the worst is that kids nowadays, born my age after Soviet Union, in those countries do not even know what the Soviet Union was. Because first of all, they don't learn anything in their schools, but secondly, properly, there is a denial from the side of their background to say properly what it was, right? There are just a few people who actually state that, but there is always, even in there, some kind of compromise they have to find, because they had somewhat to justify the fact that, of course, they were the reason why it was a Soviet Union, and nobody imposed it to them, really. They made it themselves. So, in a way, this is how we look at history in general, right? We want something to have been the way we wish for some essentially fault in our understanding. And history at this point has become so well, I mean, our historiographical capacities are so refined, and the sheer amount of historiographical production is so boundless that there is no excuse, and the access to it is so easy as never before in the history of mankind, that there is no excuse for being an ignoramus about certain things. So the same goes a bit for the Byzantine Empire. We all know that we twisted it, its memory, its identity. First we demonized it, then we kind of overly incensed it. Now we have to be honest about it. We have to be real. We have to say how it was. Point. Right? But kind of debunking what we have built. Because that it's always the same. I mean, the wrong things we've built, but it's always the same story with any ideology. Right? We need ideologies to think, but, they don't have to become dogmatism. Right? And as a conclusive note, of course, I would point out that under Bayezid II in 1492, there was, at that point, the insurance actually of Roman Orthodox survival, even prosperity, actually, because the city was still, the city government was deeply connected to the church and its power as well under the Ottomans. And still, they still exist, by the way. I mean, in Istanbul, there is factually still the last Romans that think of themselves like this, exactly because of the Orthodox Church community there, and that's remarkable. That's really remarkable. And this is what was definitely more evidently reassuring that was thought by 1393 when it said the end of the world is near. Should have been 1492. Well, the world didn't end there, in a way or another, right? And even though the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, the world and the church went on. So, yeah, I don't know how you were going to receive this video, but I think it's important, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.